Welcome to Insights. I'm Dick Goldberg. Can the pain and damage from a crime ever be healed? Can the victim forgive? Can the perpetrator clear his or her conscience? Well, that field of work is called Restorative Justice. And with us today to talk about that field is the Reverend Jerry Hancock. Jerry's a former lawyer who has spent 20 years before his ministry in the justice system. Now he's really spent a total of 40 years in the criminal justice system. After his career as a defense attorney and assistant district attorney, he became a minister. He's now the director of the prison ministry at the First Congregational Church in Madison, Wisconsin, and that ministry visits over 300 prisoners a year behind walls. Jerry, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Dick.
Can you explain to us why you got involved in restorative justice?
Well, my personal story is that as a lawyer and a prosecutor, defense attorney, I became very disenchanted with the limited perspective of the criminal justice system as it exists here in Wisconsin and really throughout the country. And maybe the best way to explain my personal journey is with a story. When I was in the district attorney's office, I was assigned to prosecute the case of a young African-American man who had stabbed a young white man through the back with something common in Wisconsin, a 30-inch bow hunting arrow. And the arrow had gone through the man's back and into his heart.
I take it this is not a common murder weapon, though.
No, not a common murder weapon, but bow hunting is something that is common to Wisconsin. Sure. And the case came to me to be prosecuted. And I remember the courtroom during the trial, and on the left side of the courtroom was the victim's family, and on the right side of the courtroom were the defendant's mother, grandmother, and uncle. And to the best of my knowledge, in the 3 days of that trial, I never spoke to the victim's family. I never spoke to the defendant's family. It wasn't part of my job. They had nothing to do with the case. They had not been present at the murder scene. They weren't witnesses. My job was to convict this young man of murder, and that's what I did. In looking back on that case, I realized that that was my job, but a very narrow view of what needed to happen in that case. There was lots of harm done by that murder. It happened at a McDonald's on the south side of Madison, in a residential area. There were lots of parents who would give their kids $1 and say, go get a Happy Meal at McDonald's. It was part of the neighborhood. That had become a crime scene. Parents no longer felt safe. I mean, they were harmed by that event. The victim, the young white man, was from a small town outside of Madison, and people there became afraid to come to Madison because of this event. And of course, the victim's family and all of his friends, but also the young defendant's mother had lost a son in this,
of course,
and a grandson. And who was going to help? There was no place in the criminal justice system for anyone to step forward and say, we need to make the community feel safe about McDonald's. We need to address these parents who've lost a son, both sets of parents who've lost a son. And to show how long this harm goes unhealed, 30 years later, 30 years after this murder, I was speaking about restorative justice on the University of Wisconsin campus here in Madison. And it was to an undergraduate sociology class. And after class, a young woman came up to me and said, "Oh, I know that story. The victim was my father's best friend.
Oh my gosh.
And when I came to school in Madison, he said I should never eat at that McDonald's."
Wow.
So this harm just continues to ripple out with no one and no institution or authority to step forward and say, we have to look at this in a broader perspective.
To reduce the harm?
To heal the harm. I mean, in other ways, when a school teacher gets sent to prison for drunk driving or some other kind of offense, no one says, who's going to teach his class? Who's going to write those college applications? You know, when a parent gets sent to prison, no one says who's going to care for their children. Now you may say, and society may say, that's not our problem because they did the crime, it's their family, they're responsible. That's short-sighted because you look at all the research and children whose parents in prison go to prison. And so there's a community, there's a need for helping the victim heal, there's a need for the offender to understand, and there's a role for the community to step up and say, we have to take responsibility.
Can you give us an example of restorative justice by taking a case and showing us how it worked?
Sure. We bring sort of the gold standard of restorative justice is something called victim offender conferencing. And many people in your audience may have seen this on television or had some in the New York Times where victims of crime, often murder, the families of murder victims meet inside the prison with the perpetrator of the crime. Okay, and the idea is to allow the victim's family to, in a way, confront the perpetrator and to ask all the questions they've wanted to ask in a way to help them heal.
Can you explain the questions they'd want to ask? Like why?
Well, like why, and they sometimes get very, very specific. Like, what did you do with my dad's billfold? Or my dad had a necklace that he always wore, or my mother had a necklace that she always wore. What happened to that necklace? You know, or sometimes it's a sense of responsibility. There was one case that I'm aware of where a brother's sister was abducted, brutally raped, and murdered. And the carjacking occurred at a gas station. And the brother had promised to fill his sister's car with gas after he'd used it, and he had not done that. And so he had this great sense of responsibility that, but for that, you know. And so to talk to the perpetrator and get some resolution, and to have the perpetrator say, no, we were looking for this particular woman, or we just like this car, we wanted this kind of car. You know, those are the kinds of things that get resolved. And so you say, okay, you understand how that could be healing for the victim. It's also, though, a sense of closure for the perpetrator, because the perpetrator can often feel that they are in some way helping this family heal by providing information that is known only to them. So you say, well, where's the role of the community in this? Well, these things are facilitated by specially trained community volunteers. And sometimes it takes a year, because you could not have these kind of things be unmediated. So the volunteers work with the perpetrator to prepare them to answer the questions, and they work with the family to prepare them for the kinds of questions.
Let me understand something here, Jerry. You're talking about getting some information. The brother finds out about that his sister might have been hijacked anyway. But it would seem to me a lot of this would be getting out their anger at this person who did this terrible thing.
Sure.
Is that part of the process?
Absolutely.
Calling them an SOB and
absolutely. Well, name calling in terms of facilitating the event. You try and discourage name calling.
Well, can you say, I'm just so angry at you for what you did?
Of course, and people walk into the room that way, and the victims come in angry, and the perpetrator is in an act of some degree of integrity, willing to accept that,
to take their anger. As a therapist, a lot of times I've said to clients, if you're angry, who's hurting? Who does that hurt, your anger? And they eventually get to see they're hurting themselves with their anger. The person they're mad at doesn't know they're angry or isn't suffering from it, but anger hurts you. Is one of the goals here to help dissipate the anger of the victim?
To help free these victims from having their lives controlled by the perpetrator.
By the anger?
By the anger they feel, and by that, because they're trapped, as you pointed out, they are trapped in that anger, and so through victim offender mediation, sometimes that anger can be be freed from that.
How? I mean, what is it the perpetrator can say who killed your sister that reduces your anger?
Well, he can tell you that he would have carjacked her anyway, that the gas was not important.
But you'd still be angry at him. You might say, well, I wasn't as responsible, but this guy is still, I want to just kill him.
But through the conversation, and these things evolve into conversations, sometimes hours, sometimes over a series of visits. There is a connection made through shared suffering that allows both sides to move on with their lives. And it's in some ways sort of mysterious, because you think, how could... And we're not talking about forgiveness here. Let's be clear. The forgiveness is not the goal of restorative justice. Healing is the goal of restorative justice. And so by freeing the victims of the unresolved anger that they have, and by allowing the perpetrator to have a role in that healing, people get better.
What's the difference between forgiveness and healing?
Forgiveness, in the theory and practice of restorative justice, forgiveness is sometimes called the F word, because you always want to be sure to empower victims. And in empowering victims, you have to recognize that forgiveness belongs only to them. And I think it's possible to heal without forgiving.
How do you do that?
Well, through understanding and recognition that if you get some of these questions answered, if you can move beyond the entrapment of your own anger, then you can heal. But that doesn't require that
You forgive.
to move beyond anger doesn't require full forgiveness. And again, forgiveness is such a private domain of victims. Restorative justice never wants to really intrude into that.
Can I speculate on how the person could get this healing? If you understand the perpetrator was where they were, like where they were coming from, that they were abused, they were this and that, and their life was a mess, and they had no ability to make judgments and all that.
Right.
That allows you to not hate them as much.
Right. Exactly right, Dick. You're really a smart guy. You figured that out, and it's another way to think about this is empathy.
Mm-hmm.
That in these dynamics, there's the possibility of empathy on the part of the perpetrator in understanding the way that the harm of the crime has rippled through the lives of his victims.
But wouldn't that make the perp feel even worse?
Well, no, in a way, because understanding and being truly sorry for that and having an ability to express that sorrow is healing. And for the families, let's assume we're talking about a murder case here, for the families to understand, as you put it, where the perpetrator was coming from, the suffering that they may very well have had in their own lives, is a way of creating empathy. Empathy. Martin Luther King said, "Sympathy is feeling sorry for somebody. Empathy is feeling sorry with somebody." So
I've heard stories of how a person who survives the death of someone who was killed, a spouse, whatever, or a child, after these things, they become friends.
Right.
You heard about that?
Sure. Oh yeah. I mean it is a result that can certainly occur through these things, and it's something we work towards in our program. We do it. The one-on-one victim offender dialogues take sometimes 2 years to organize, and they're very intensive. We use in our program, we bring together groups of 20 or 25 inmates, and we use what are called surrogate victims, which are victims of real crimes, but not of the crimes of the men in the group. And they come in and tell their stories of being victimized and the way that it has rippled through the lives of their families and the community. And the men respond to those stories. And even though it's not their victim, they begin to recognize their victims in the stories of these other people. And again, it's that empathetic dialogue that can happen.
I would think for the perpetrator, one thing this does is it makes them feel better about themselves, that they've somehow helped the victim.
Right. Of course. I mean, that they have helped. They have spent maybe years trapped in this inability, because the criminal justice system actively discourages any kind. I mean, there's no way really that within the criminal justice system as it's currently structured, that this dialogue could occur before trial, before sentencing. because no defense attorney is going to allow his client or her client to answer these kinds of questions.
Sure.
So,
it's more information, more fodder
right,
for the DA.
Right. So you try and minimize, and from the standpoint of the DA doesn't want the victim's family to be re-victimized or harmed more, and so it just can't happen.
What is the benefit to society? I can see to the perpetrator and to the victim the benefits. Is there any societal benefits?
Well, I think there's great benefit to society in terms of let's talk about maybe the idea of ripples of benefit for the volunteers that are trained to mediate these one-on-one conversations. They gain a huge understanding of the harm that's been created, and they can, while not revealing any confidences, tell the story of these events in the wider community, that gives the wider community some better understanding of the harm that's been caused. And then, once that information becomes available, the wider community can see how it can help heal that harm by making maybe these things more available, or by addressing, that, wow, we didn't know that this guy who committed this murder has 3 children who never get to visit him. And maybe we could do something. Maybe we could start a program where we take a bus once a month of kids to visit their fathers in prison. So it can, the ripples of healing can grow throughout the community.
Can we go back to the McDonald's case you opened with?
Sure.
Was that a situation that had restorative justice, or was that just an example of a tragedy?
It certainly was a tragedy, and I would claim it as an example of restorative justice because that story motivated me to become involved in restorative justice. And through my becoming involved, there are probably 100 volunteers, community volunteers, that have been part of the restorative justice program inside the walls.
Now, did that particular case, was that amenable to restorative justice? Did you do that case?
No.
Okay.
No.
If you had, let's just pretend.
If I had.
Certainly there'd be some victim in the perp, I get. But how would you help the community if that was ideally resolved?
I would have... I probably would have sent police officers into the community to meet with the PTO at schools, or maybe even go door to door, or to show up at soccer games and say, look, here's what happened at McDonald's. Here's why it happened. And here's what we've done about it. And you should understand that it's still safe to send your kid to McDonald's. That we recognize that you're concerned, that you're worried about this, and maybe even go down to Fort Atkinson, which is the name of the town where the victim was from, and say, look, we're really sorry this happened to one of your children here, and we want you to know that we're doing things to make Madison safer, and we apologize that this happened in Madison, and we want you to feel safe in coming to this McDonald's, so that 30 years later I don't meet this undergraduate who says, my dad says I should never go to that McDonald's.
Wow. How common are these kind of programs around the country?
Very. And let me emphasize, Dick, that the kind of restorative justice program that I do, which is basically victim, offender, community-based inside prison, is just one of many, many different kinds. The key ingredients, what makes something a restorative justice program, is that you bring victims, offenders, and the community together to heal the harm caused by crime. And those ingredients can be put together in their, to use a Wisconsin metaphor, there are probably as many different kinds of restorative justice as there are kinds of cheese.
Well, in the
But they all have that same ingredient.
The perpetrator and the victim I get.
Right.
The community seems more abstract to me, how you bring the community into all these cases.
Well, again, you bring them in by, in my program, having them come and listen.
By just having people in the community be there.
Just having people in the community be there to show the victims and offenders that they're not alone.
Okay.
And that when they come back, when either the victim comes back or the offender comes back, there are concerned people in the community that are there to help.
Wow. In closing, is there any place you can refer people to if they want to learn more about this, want to get involved in restorative justice?
Right. The best academic website for restorative justice, kind of the best theoretical models of restorative justice, come out of Eastern Mennonite University.
Oh my goodness.
So I would encourage you to go to their website and just that will be solid information on all kinds of restorative justice. And the godfather of restorative justice, to probably use an inappropriate term, is Howard Zehr, Z-E-H-R, who is a professor at Eastern Mennonite. Wow. So that was where I would send people.
Well, Jerry Hancock, I'd like to thank you very much for filling us in on this area. It's very interesting and sounds very important. And I hope you listening will join us on the next edition of Insights.